Hi, Seth.
Hello.
Hello. How you going?
Hey, I'm good.
That's good.
Good to
Good.
meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you face to face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you say these days? Like, I've never, I was watching you talk to Guy last night, and I feel like I know him really well, but it's still just a Zoom screen.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It is a bit strange in this new age where everything happens on Zoom, it seems.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
it feels like meeting face to face, although you're just talking to a computer screen. It's bizarre.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's like, hey, I'm not watching a video of you.
Yeah. You're actually moving in real time and saying things in response to me. It's crazy.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate you making the time
yeah,
and having a chat.
totally.
Yeah. So, I guess I was interested in your experience with Feldenkrais because I guess that's how I first came across you,
Right.
was in your conversation with Guy and talking about your history with Feldenkrais. So I
Mhm.
think that's a good place to start. I just wanted to ask you about Feldenkrais. Maybe you could start by telling us like what it is, what Feldenkrais actually is.
Oh, are we rolling already?
Yeah, we're recording. I chucked the record button on at the start, so I don't have to worry
That's
about later having this awkward moment where it's like, can we
okay.
start recording?
All right. Well, let's talk about it then. Right on. Yeah. Well, shoot. Okay. Um, it's funny because, you know, if I try to trace how I know you, you mentioned Guy Sengstock and, how do how did I find out about Guy Sengstock? It was through John Vervaeke, and I
Yeah,
remembered some time ago seeing you talk. So like this is like how you and I maybe know each other, and we're doing
yeah,
this funny thing where we're not talking to each other as a video, but we're in real time. So when I discovered Feldenkrais, it was 10 years ago. But it's also like, oh, I was in a totally different universe. It's like, um, to talk about it, it's like, oh, do I just tell that story that I've been telling all the time? Because we know how to tell our own stories. And what I find is, I've been reframing what Feldenkrais is over the last few years, starting with meeting John Vervaeke's work. And but okay, so I'm just sort of like noticing that the simple question is actually more complicated for me, and so I'm trying
yeah,
to be true to what the
yeah,
real answer is.
for sure.
Um, but I was like just totally lost in life at that point, and the reason for that, could be another story. But I'd sort of headed in one direction for a long time, and then it sort of hit a dead end. And then I was in a place where I was like looking around, what do I do? And the sort of simple thing that seemed clear to me is I don't know how to solve these problems in life, but I could try to be more healthy. So I started running, and then I discovered yoga, and I started just searching for anything like that. So I found Feldenkrais. Um, and if anyone's listening to this and they don't know what it is, get more into it. But it's on the face of it, it's a movement practice. And if I fast forward to where I'm at now and, meeting up with a person like you and trying to talk about this, I wouldn't have said this in the beginning, but what I say now is Feldenkrais method is like a wisdom practice disguised as movement practice.
Mm.
Um, but I think it hit me in the body that way because, as I say, I wasn't. A lot of people discover this work because they have physical pain, or they're a musician or an athlete trying to, go to the next level or something. That wasn't me. I was just this person who was like, I don't know what to do, but I'll try to be more healthy. And then I stumbled on this thing that, you know, like some things I heard in my training was, okay, sure, we're moving the arms or we're looking at patterns in the spine, but it's all of it is the brain. You
Yeah,
know, you're touching that person's foot, you're touching their brain. And so that's maybe starts to give you the flavor of it. But my own personal experience was like, I feel different. Like I'm a different kind of person, or my capacities feel different after this. And I could talk to you about flexibility, and my breath got easier and all of those things, which did happen.
Yeah.
But I think what really captured, you know, my interest was that sort of deeper shift in my sense of self. And
Mm.
so by the time you would have seen this conversation I did with Guy, like that's how I think of it now. But I'm still like, you can hear me struggling to kind of language it.
Yeah.
Um, so how is that for an all over the place answer?
No, no, that's great. No, I appreciate that. And I especially appreciate the part where you were talking about where you were in life at the time you came across
Yeah,
it, because I think that's a very common experience for people that are looking for something deeper in life. They might not necessarily know what it is, or
yeah,
where to look even, but that was certainly true for me. Like I did the whole university, corporate life, and worked my ass off trying to work my way up the corporate ladder and everything like that, and got to a certain point in life where I thought, why am I doing this? Like, it just didn't make as much sense as it used to, and I'm stressing myself out to the point of having anxiety attacks and just feeling like depressed with a lot of the way my life was set up. And yeah, started looking for different things that could initially inject a bit of meaning or a bit of existential purpose for me back into my life. And for me, the path was more spirituality, Buddhism initially, and
mm,
I threw myself into that. And then I guess as I've matured in that sense, I've also started looking at other practices and things like yoga, Tai Chi for me, which I have in common with John Vervaeke, which I found really interesting. Um,
mm,
Meditation, and Feldenkrais as well. I hadn't heard of even Feldenkrais until I came across your video with Guy. But then the way you described it, it has all these elements of presence, embodiment, attunement, getting in touch with that sense of self, as you are in the world as a human being. And yeah, it kind of scratches that itch. And
mm.
so yeah, I'm interested to explore it more myself, actually. I mentioned to you in another conversation just through text that I looked for a local practitioner and found someone. So I still haven't had that first session yet, but I'm looking forward to
Oh,
it.
okay.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Oh, okay. I would have loved to hear about it. So you'll have to tell me when that happens.
Yes, absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and when I listened to you describe your journey, like I also heard you say something about, your experience in the corporate world, and then at a certain point it didn't feel meaningful.
Yes.
Uh, and that was my experience too back then. I mean, part of what I could say about the backstory was I through through college and a few years after, the path that I thought I was on, to the degree that it was going somewhere, as I was going to be a musician.
Yeah.
And of course, we all know that's not like an easy road. And for a number of reasons, I didn't really have the means to make it. But anyway, I got detoured away from it. And so part of my sort of personal meaning crisis, let's say, is that I had this deep love and participation in music, and then it just like I was got involved in other things, so I wasn't connected to my musical friends anymore. And one of the things that I think happened, um, and I could talk a lot about the Feldenkrais method, but maybe it's just embodiment. Maybe Tai Chi would be just as good. I happen to be, like I think most Feldenkrais practitioners are, I am a bit of an advocate for Feldenkrais, because I think there's something really unique about what this man understood that has been missed by a lot of people. And at the same time, it's getting captured in different ways in other modalities. But one of the things that I think was awakened in me again was like that feeling I used to have when I was making music with other people. Like, that my body was like, if we borrowed a term from John Vervaeke, it was that participatory experience, and I can remember younger, like I grew up essentially atheist, right? And so if you're atheist, separate from your explanations of how the world works, you just don't experience the community that
Yeah.
is religion. You don't stand in a group and sing and feel the power of 100 voices or whatever together, which although I can remember like being a kid at the baseball game, and
Yeah.
when the team hit a home run, and then like the coolest thing was the crowd. It was like, oh my God, like, and like probably as a kid, I thought, it's my hero hitting a home run, but it's actually this swelling of,
Yes.
um, yeah. I'm having a lot of different thoughts. So I'm kind of not sure where to go with it, but I guess there's a thing about embodiment that is the fact that we can't put it into words,
Mm.
which is something, it's just these sensations that are running through me right now that sort of tell me this is meaningful, that tell me, wow, I'm alive, that, and, just before we were talking, I was listening to one of the most recent videos of John Vervaeke talking about AI. And part of my reaction to that is just like, well, this is like above my pay grade. I don't even know how to have a conversation about all that. But
Yeah.
what I can see is that, among other things, it's potentially one more invitation for the human body to, seem irrelevant.
Yeah.
Like I could just, and yet every time I use my body in a way, it brings me back to something. So I actually think that I understand you work with clients, and think you do counseling, or
Counseling. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
But even just talking to someone about their experience and helping them process it, or you know look what happened during the pandemic. Everyone suddenly was taking online movement classes.
Mm,
Like,
mm.
I think there's something profoundly important, about this in a world where people are so sedentary, and you know,
Yes.
so. But it's almost a lot to process, even just like even having discovered something like the Feldenkrais method, which is so potent.
Yeah.
But like the landscape is also, out there is like, wow, how do we respond to this? And I feel like I have my finger on something that's part of the answer, and yet it's still like, because people come to you out of the meeting crisis looking for help, and it's like, whoa.
Yeah, totally,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, it has, I guess, heightened through the pandemic. These last few years seems like it's been, yeah, a lot of interest in these kinds of practices. Yeah, driven by something like a global, virus that locked us all inside for a while and caused a lot of people to get very scared and start looking at their lives and go, well, what is my life actually about? Like they started asking questions that they hadn't necessarily asked before, and then started looking for some of these tools and things. Yeah, my interest, I guess, my main interest is in spirituality, enlightenment, higher consciousness. But I do see embodiment being a very important piece of that, because
Yeah.
I think those sort of things can get very disembodied and very heady and esoteric, and they need to be grounded in the reality of day-to-day experience to really have any impact. I think like you can talk about concepts all day, but unless you
Right.
live, it doesn't really make any difference. And so yeah, like my interest in the embodiment piece has come through uh the teachings on spirituality, and then trying to ground them into my everyday life. And I've noticed in myself, like trying to tune into myself, that I am often very intellectual and often very up here in my head, and I'm not naturally in my body and experiencing what's happening in my body. So it's really nice for me to practice yoga and to practice Tai Chi and to slow everything down and get
Yeah.
down here. And it is,
Yeah.
like you say, a different experience of self and a different experience of life when I can you know, tune in that way. So it is valuable. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Something you just said is like about the two different speeds. Like
Yeah.
the mind is really fast and the body, well, it seems a little simplistic to say the body's slower, but to be in the body, I think it slows us down because, well, let's just put it this way. I think we're all pretty fluent in the
Mm,
language of language, shall we say, which is the language up here. We're
mm,
less fluent in the language of sensation.
mm,
But, to give you a concrete example with Feldenkrais, and this is one of the reasons why I feel like it's legitimate to say it's a wisdom practice. So all kinds of practices of transformation and spirituality use the breath, right? So that's kind of a foregone conclusion. But one of the things that he pointed out is, let's say you're bringing your hand up over your head like this, right? Well, this is, we could describe it as a physical task in the field of gravity, right? And we could sort of say, how efficient is it? And if I sort of slumped while I was doing it, it gets harder to lift my arm because the rest of my body is sinking, right? Well, let's say I'm doing that, but I'm not so aware, and I'm not. But if I just listen to my breath here, maybe you can hear my voice is starting to go a little like that. Versus here, I can breathe, and and
mm,
and so one of the things that'll happen in a movement lesson in a Feldenkrais class is you'll be practicing some kind of movement like this, and you'll be asked to monitor your breath moment by moment. And so it's not just remember to breathe. Yes, that's important, because we hold our breaths and whatnot. But the second you hold your breath, he would say, that is, you're using excess effort. So the
yeah.
second that you notice that, or your breath constricts slightly, stop, go back, because if you keep going, which is in most, fitness culture, it's like no pain, no gain, push through it.
Yes.
But what you're also doing, the way he would explain it, is you're teaching your nervous system that it has to struggle,
Yeah.
and you're also dulling your senses by, just ignoring the pain and all the rest. So you're actually making yourself less sensitive.
Mm,
Whereas, if you do these movements, and you can do these tiny movements, like if you ask someone to turn their head left and right, some people, have neck pain and they turn that far, it hurts. But because they need to change lanes in traffic, they just get used to sort of bracing and,
yeah.
doing something and turning their head further than if they were paying attention.
Yeah.
So if they lie on the floor for a half an hour and make the tiniest movements, the nervous system has this experience that it never normally has, which is like, oh, you're not making me do something that I have to brace against. And then the not needing to brace will actually create a situation where the nervous system and the brain are, and I'm not the best at explaining the inner workings, but I'm explaining it this way because it's been my own experience. Like pretty soon I'm turning my head much further because I'm not bracing.
Mm, mm.
And so this is like, but it's a different language. It's not English.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's it's my breath. It's the
Yeah.
length of my spine. It's, there's different laws of, like why things are balanced,
Yeah.
you know, in the field of gravity. But it's also true that like the relationship of the weight of my head and the weight of my pelvis and how they're working together, if they all go this way, I'm starting to fall. But if one goes opposite, right? And so, and then you can fine tune it. You can get to the place where you're at the edge of your balance, and then you can listen to your breath, and you can make the tiniest movements that do not disturb the breath. And it looks like, what are we doing there? But then afterwards, there's a reorganization of a global pattern.
Yes. Yes.
So this is the kind of thing that can happen.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I really like those two examples. The lifting the arm up either with the slump shoulders or with the open chest, and the turning of the neck. Like I can feel in me like there's this interest in that, because the way you're describing it, there's a curiosity about the experience that kind of feeds through all of what you're talking about. And I imagine what Feldenkrais is about. And it's that curiosity that really intrigues me, because, yeah, I know from personal experience, when I get really curious about my own experience, my own, patterns, my own habits, all of that stuff, there is insight that comes from that, and there can be change that comes from that. And that's not just necessarily from an embodiment perspective. That can be, from a psychotherapy perspective, from a counseling perspective, being in tune with someone else and helping them see their habits and patterns of the mind, and helping them recognize something about themselves that they hadn't noticed before, and then maybe making a different choice. It's kind of applying that presence and that curiosity to what's going on in the body and the breath and the muscles and the nervous system and the spine and all the rest of it. And I when I sense that, I can feel it in me, like, oh yeah, right, I'm interested in that, like I'm with you on that. Yeah.
Well, and the thing too is, like, if anyone needs to improve their body, like, by all means do this, but also just think about, like, as you and I are sitting here, there doesn't seem to be like any big demand on our bodies. But if we were both, in chronic pain while we were talking, how would that shift the conversation? Or if, there's just this weird, unexplainable sensation in the left side of my abdomen or whatever, like, that changes how our sense of self shows up in each moment.
Yes.
And so, I mean, in terms of, like, how is Feldenkrais marketed? Even to some degree, how do I personally market what I do? Of course, we talk about, finding more comfort in the body, finding more efficiency. But I mean, part of what I'm really interested in too is, like, how do I experience myself when my body feels totally functional versus, when it doesn't, I mean, on the days where I have aches and pains, I'm a lot more likely to just slip into some, self-criticism, or I'll never be able to X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, sure, because you twisted your ankle, you're going to need to stay off of your leg, not go running for a few days. But it's like, I can turn that into, like, I'm probably going to be a failure in life, like, I can do that,
of course.
And, the other thing on the flip side of it is that, I mean, I know I had the experience early on with Feldenkrais a couple of times of, like, I didn't know I could feel this good. Like, I was feeling fine, but then I tried this thing and now I'm feeling better than fine. Like, how did that happen? And, discovering a kind of a flow state. Yeah, there was something that you were saying, and it occurred to me this might be a way of making a comparison, but you were talking about just curiosity. And if you think about meditation, like, a lot of people just think, well, it's boring.
Yeah.
You're just sitting there. But then people who've been meditating for years and years probably think, no, this is the most fascinating thing you could possibly do. So just think about, how does that occur?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. No, it is a good comparison. Meditation is a good comparison because, yeah, on the surface of it, you're just sitting there, you're not doing much. There's maybe thoughts coming up. It can be really difficult when you first start trying to practice meditation. But if you stick at it and you can get curious about your experience and keep coming back to the breath and letting thoughts just glide on by, there's a depth that you can go to that's beneath what the surface level experience is, and there is depths and depths and depths that you can keep going down. So yeah, once you become an experienced meditator, that curiosity arises and you want to, for me anyway, I want to go deeper. I want to experience, well, what else is there? Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. I liked what you were saying about the sense of self, and I hear in that the the wisdom practice that Feldenkrais can be, because the sense of self and the depth of self-awareness, depth of self-understanding, I see as a wisdom, a way of having wisdom is having wisdom of the self. And I saw one of your Facebook posts recently that I wanted to talk
Sure.
about, because it really resonated with me. And so I'll just read it out.
Okay, great.
It's do you ever get bored with your routine every day, driving through the same streets, the same nagging concerns, the same responsibilities that can't be ignored, the same daydreams that go unfulfilled, the same aches and pains, the same difficulties with family members or co-workers, and on and on. When it all feels the same as yesterday, this kills aliveness. It gets more difficult to feel animated, motivated, and concentrated on what's important. Your mind is dying for anything new and exciting. And yes, Netflix can provide that, but only in a limited way. AI is stirring things up these days, but a lot of the fear and magical thinking, there is nothing new. But what's missing isn't new stimuli. While changing up your routine can be very valuable, traveling abroad, tasting new foods, taking a class to learn a new skill, there's something deeper that has to change in order to make everyday life into a place you're not always trying to escape from. When you recognize that everything that seems unchanging is actually part of a relationship, you and these streets, you and these concerns, responsibilities, and daydreams, you and these aches and pains, you and the other people in your life, then you begin to ask, what am I thinking or doing that is the same as always? How could I be more creative in my observations and actions? What is there to see below the surface of things that appear so familiar to me at first glance? Because you can't travel to a new culture every single day, but you can be intentional with how you relate to the things that a tired mind tells you are always the same. You can stretch your imagination in ways that make you more present rather than out to lunch. Or you can settle for the same old day after day. What do you choose? So yeah, I really, really liked that post. And what spoke to me in the post, well, there's a few things. The first thing that spoke to me was that sense of boredom and deadness that can creep into our everyday lives, that sense of being a zombie, just kind of existing. You know, I've got to do my work, I've got to take care of my chores, I've got to, you know, eat enough food, do enough exercise. Like I've got an endless to-do list. I've got to make all that happen. And that can creep in if we're not careful. And you know, you start thinking, oh, another day. Why do I have to get up and do this same routine again another day? And then that sense, the way you position, well, what's similar in this experience, and it's that sense of self that is always in relationship to whatever our experience is. And that sense of self is always there. And then to me, what I hear underneath it is there's a responsibility there on you to notice how you're showing up, and then to see how you can show up in a different way that might change your experience to that. So, and then the possibility of aliveness on the other side of that. So I really, really liked that, the way you put that. It really spoke to me quite deeply. And yeah, I just wanted to share that with you and share my appreciation.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's fun to hear you read it back and be like, oh, well, okay, good. Glad that landed.
Yeah.
Um, I remember, so, it's funny. One of the things that I find, I don't know if this ever happens to you, but since I'm sort of swimming in these kinds of ideas all the time, because what I do is I offer them to other people and I have clients and work with them. But I also have my own personal practice.
Mm.
Is actually one of the easiest ways for me to lose my sense of presence is that I start thinking, oh, what I just did, I could teach this. And then I'm like rehearsing teaching a class in my head rather than meditating like I was a minute ago, because I'm like, oh, something just got clearer. Well, how can I explain that? And then I'm like, then I lost it.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because so when I wrote that, there was something I've been doing for a long time but it kind of crystallized into a phrase. And my phrase was being attentive to the world.
Mm.
And part of what came up is, so I drove my daughter to school in the morning, and I was driving home, and it's, how many times have I driven up and down the street? And it's this 6-lane road. And it's not that pretty, it's like a bunch of stores and a bunch of cars and but in Washington, D.C., I think this is better than a lot of cities in the US, but they do plant trees, right? And so I was looking up the street and I was seeing cars, and then I looked a little upwards and I just noticed, actually, this is like, it's like a corridor of trees. If I just take my eyes from the cars that much up, and then I'm looking up into, and it was up a hill, and then there was enough trees in the distance that there was sort of a space, and it was almost like the
Yeah.
sky, and it was like, and whatever, it's just the frame that I'm choosing. But
Yes.
I kind of realized, if I'm really attentive, and this is the other thing that happened. My daughter's a teenager, and so teenagers, sometimes don't want to go along with their parents. There's a little push and pull, and I had dropped her to school that morning, and I can't even remember what our discussion was, but we'd had some back and forth, and I was kind of thinking about it,
Mm.
and like, okay, I want her to do this, that, and the other thing, but I don't want to be too much of a tyrant as a father, and how can I? And so as I was driving up, there was I got sort of stopped at the light or something, and I looked and I saw these people walking on the street, and there was this one man, and he was walking up the sidewalk, but there was a driveway, and there was a car that needed to come out, and he just lost it. This car, and he was yelling and like waving, and then it was so mad, and then the car eventually went out into traffic, and he was like still, you know, and I was like, wow, this guy's seems pretty miserable. Like he can't, like a minute later, he was right behind the people who, he had
Yeah.
fallen behind because of the car. Like overall, he didn't lose any time in his day that
Yeah.
I could see. But I was just looking at him thinking, gosh, it would be miserable to be this guy. And then I thought, well, actually, I was just going over in my head my own kind of capacity to regulate when my temper might come up or something. And then I just thought, this doesn't have to be mystical, but isn't it interesting that for some reason, this man appeared at this moment while I was thinking about this thing. And if I hadn't looked up and seen him, I mean, it gave me perspective on my situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't have to say God put the guy there. It doesn't really matter. But I just noticed if I'm attentive,
Yeah.
because it's so easy for us to just be, in our head, especially in our car, in our head.
Totally.
So this is something that I'm thinking about, and it goes to that thing that the post that you read aloud is just like, how are we taking in what's there? There's so many different ways to take it in. It's the same street no matter what, but what
Yeah.
is it that I pay attention to? How do I reflect on it? What do I do with it?
Yes. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. What it makes me think about. So yeah, I appreciate that story and the phrase being attentive to the world. What it makes me think about is some psychotherapy training that I'm doing at the moment. It's a form of psychotherapy called Gestalt. And I don't know if you may have heard of it. It was founded well, it was founded earlier than that, but it came to popularity around the 60s and 70s in the Esalen Institute in California, Fritz Perls and a bunch of other practitioners. And it's a really interesting form of psychotherapy because it's all about the present moment and attuning into the present moment experience. And rather than trying to make really intelligent interpretations of what you think is going on with the person, it's just about observing and describing what you can see and what you can notice now about the person and reflecting that back to them. And often that can change the dynamic in the relationship between the two of you, because you're reflecting something to the person that they may or may not have been aware of. And there's a depth that you can travel to in Gestalt that I've found that is really interesting in the simplicity of it. It doesn't seem really complicated or really yeah, it doesn't seem much to it. But then when you start practicing it, there is quite a interesting depth that you can travel to. And it made me start thinking about that when you were talking about attentiveness to the world, because when I'm practicing that form of psychotherapy, I am particularly attempting to be attentive to the person that's in front of me and the room and the environment and myself as well, because that's an important part of it, is being attuned to myself, my own emotional experience, what's happening for me as I am in contact with this person. And there's so much there that can be missed and overlooked. And we often overlook things so easily, but they can be keys, they can unlock things within us. So yeah, I just noticed myself going there as you're speaking, like, yeah, right, that being attentive to the world can change the experience so much. And it can be so important if we can really practice that over and over again and just make that our default sort of mode of being.
Yeah. I have a friend who I go on a walk with him, or I go on a walk with him. What did I just say? Every couple of weeks. And I mean, he has a number of practices. The main one is contact improvisation. I don't know if you know this form of dancing where basically people, they call it sharing weight. You can lean on the person, but it's expected. But
Okay.
it's if you're familiar a little bit, I know at least that you've connected with Guy with circling, you
Yes.
know, and this
Exactly.
practice of sort of being authentic and just sharing what's real. And
Yeah.
it's a kind of a physical intimacy that's very vulnerable. I mean, people can have obviously a, you know, response of like that involves sexuality, but it doesn't have to. In fact, you know, you could be with someone you're not attracted to, but your body is in very close proximity, and it's just like my body, your body. How can we move? What happens if I can lean on you? All these possibilities. Anyway, it's interesting because when I talk to him, um, you know, he'll teach people some of the physical coordination that you need to know to do that well. But it's also very much this practice of where is your attention, you know, and one of the first rules is actually, or in his way of teaching it, is like you really have to take care of yourself, right? Like I'm leaning on the other person, but I don't fall and expect them to catch me, you know. But then there is this way of listening, you know, that can grow up between the two people. Anyway, I'm trying to give you a little picture of contact improvisation, but there's this idea that he has that's just more generally about awareness that I've sort of adopted, and he just likes to ask, you know, notice what you're noticing, and you give a moment to notice what you're noticing, like what comes to the foreground. There's all these things, like, and then he follows it up by saying, notice what you're not noticing, which is, you know, you can't notice what you're not noticing, but it's an invitation to notice something new. Or it reminds me of something that Guy says about listening, where he says listening begins when you realize you're not listening, right? And that's the beginning of listening. And so I think we can refresh that over and over if we like. And when I'm listening to you describe the Gestalt therapy, it's like it's just one more context. Let's just say therapy, because it sounds like Gestalt is trying to get past this boundary. But there's a way that we know what the context is. I know where my attention is supposed to be, and I know where it's not supposed to be. And there might be very good reasons why, you know, like we put the attention on, if I'm trying to hit a target with a bow, I mean, I better be looking, you know, there. But, you know, there's also just like we've narrowed the range of possibility every time we point our attention one way. We've I was listening to a teacher. Do you know this guy, Rob Berbea?
No.
He's a Buddhist teacher. I mean, I just know him through the internet, but I think he has sort of a cult following because he's sort of turned a lot of the teachings, I don't know, on their head. But in any case, he's got a ton of lectures, and he was talking about, like anytime we shine the light of attention somewhere, there's another place that we put into the darkness,
Mhm.
and so yeah, and I guess what's interesting to me, I'm just getting to know you and talking, but I know it's meaningful to you if I use this phrase, the ecology of practices, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
what I notice is obviously each one of these practices, from Gestalt therapy to contact improvisation to Feldenkrais meditation, they are different,
yeah,
and yet it's in some way the same principles over and
yeah.
over again
Mhm.
is what I often notice.
Totally.
Um,
Yeah.
and so that's what I'm kind of really curious about with the thing about how do I deal with driving home,
Mhm.
from dropping off my daughter at school in a situation like, how is that practice? You
Mhm.
know, not because I'm like so obsessed with practice that I want to practice all the time, but it's like I'm really good at going into autopilot. And I have sort of figured out, that if I would do that less in general, that would be a better life. So it's become a thing for me where I feel like I am in practice quite often.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
no, same. Yeah, same for me. I'm always feel like I'm practicing something or noticing something new about the practices that I am doing and trying to improve them or change them in some way. Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
that thing of attention, where you put your attention, there's a thing that Sigmund Freud used to say about, the conscious part of our minds being an iceberg, and the 10% of the iceberg that's above the water. And then 90% of our minds is the unconscious, that's the part of the iceberg below the water. And Fritz Perls in Gestalt changed that up by talking about the conscious mind being a rubber ball in the water that's floating on the surface of the water, but it's spinning. So
Mm,
there's not necessarily always going to be the same part of the mind that's conscious. It's always changing depending on where we're shifting our attention. Like you were saying, you can shift your attention to any part of the mind or any part of your experience, but there will always be a part that is not being paid attention to. And it's curious,
mm,
it's interesting to notice what that is. And I think, the teachings around spirituality and non-dual awareness, can speak to that as well. I mean, the non-dual teachings point to the fact that we are all one. Essentially, we are one consciousness, and human beings are emerging from that one consciousness. And if we can train our attention to be a witness of our mind, sort of behind our mind at all times, it gives us a different perspective on life. We're not so identified with the body, we're not so identified with the self. We're a witness and we're removed from that. And it's a kind of new quality of attention that can be cultivated and trained over time, and then can be brought into the world as well, which shifts the perspective, can be quite significantly. But yeah, just again, that concept of attention can be so powerful. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Right.
I actually wanted to ask you about the work you've been doing recently around entrepreneurs and burnout, and being
Right.
overwhelmed as entrepreneurs, because again, that resonates with me and my own experience. I've found myself burnt out two times in particular that I remember really vividly in my life. And burnout has always been something that has been with me and that I've been aware of as a looming threat, if you will. So
Right.
as my self-care practices have become more important to me, I'm constantly like checking in with myself. How are my stress levels? How am I managing my workload at the moment, and how can I improve my relationship to that? But I'm interested in why, in particular, you're interested in working with overwhelmed entrepreneurs, or why that speaks to you.
Sure. Can I just ask you a question first?
Go for it.
I'm
Yeah,
just, I'm just because you brought it up. So I'm just wondering if you could like put some more flesh
yeah,
on the word burnout from your own experience. Like what did that feel like, or what was that?
Yeah. So one particular time that I can remember was I was working on a project at work, and it was quite an important project for our team. It was a big budget software development piece, and the outcomes of this project were going to have pretty large implications for the way our team did their jobs every day. And so this is a large team. It was about 100 people in the team nationally. I live in Perth, which is on the west coast of Australia. So our team was about 20. So we were a smaller team of a larger subset. And, we used to do like stakeholder interviews and stuff and get feedback from the partners and important people in the practice about how this thing was going. And I remember just the feeling in my body when a partner would say something negative about the software that they were looking at. It was like, oh, it was really impactful, because I was so I took this so personally, that this project was mine and I had to make it work for everyone. And when we started to get closer and closer towards launch and closer to actually being able to show this to clients and work with them, we started to get more of this feedback, and some of the partners, weren't happy with it, weren't on board with it, wanted to change a lot of what was going on. And I started to take that home with me, and it really stressed me out. It really impacted me. And so I would be thinking about it at home at night, and then I'd wake up, the next morning, and it would be on my mind. It'd be on my mind while I was in the shower. It just felt like it lived with me, and I didn't get that space to just sit back from it and breathe. So I kind of lived with it for 3 to 6 months, and it just ate away at me slowly, to the point where it really impacted my sleep quality. It really impacted my anxiety, and I wasn't enjoying myself at work. I remember leaving work and feeling relief, and like I'm glad I get to go home now,
Right.
and dreading going to work the next day. So that experience of burnout was really intense for me, and it's something that I wouldn't wish upon anyone. It was really dreadful for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, as I listen to you describe that, it's like, I think I called this before, your own personal version of the meaning crisis, right?
Mm.
Like, and I mean, it's fascinating to me. Like, so I heard you say you're on a team with 100 people. So just imagining the pressure of 100 people, you know, are looking at this thing that I did. And then what is that negative comment? I mean, yes, intellectually, it's just some words that I could brush off, but, potentially it's, my reputation, or, you know, maybe if you were to tell yourself it was your livelihood, then another voice would come in and say, don't be ridiculous. And then, but then it's like that internal, and I wake up the next morning thinking about it. It's like, well, what are all the things I would want it to be thinking about that I wasn't thinking about, because I kept being attracted to this thing. And then you even mentioned, like, in the body. I mean, a lot of people in this world, I think, are overwhelmed. It occurred to me that, the thing that I'm working on right now, I wouldn't have to change much to say this is really important for overwhelmed parents, and of course, a lot of entrepreneurs are parents, which is another level. Um, so in a funny way, it's partly just who I think could really benefit, but it's not the only people, and it's also my experience, right? In my own sort of career path, let's say, I never enjoyed any of the ways really that I found to make money, except for this. This is the detour I didn't mention after music. I was working in factory jobs for about a decade, and actually, there was a certain, I mean, if you talk about what it's like to work in a factory and you're not paid enough, and the way the boss talks to you, and the way there's a lot that's negative, but I was using my body every day and feeling, my body is. Like, it really felt like I was accomplishing a thing. I come from a family that, I think the assumption growing up was that somehow I'm going to prove to the world that I'm intelligent, and in some way I'll end up being paid to be intelligent. And anyways, entrepreneurs are of all stripes, but potentially an entrepreneur is a person who doesn't feel comfortable in the cookie cutter employment opportunities that the world offers, and they want to create something that feels important or solve a problem that they have a unique way, and yet there's really no blueprint for how to do it. So, yeah, we could think of a lot of people, a lot of categories of people would be overwhelmed, but I think that a particular thing about the entrepreneur, and like even you reading back to me my post on Facebook, a part of me is so relieved, like, oh God, because that's my identity that I put out on social media, on some level, with the hopes that someone will think that I have something of value to offer. And then, if they want to sign up for the program or not, there's a level that my personal, self-worth feels all tangled up in this, and of course, so you take any business program, they'll start talking about, like how you've got to separate from that and stuff. Well, that's actually, it's funny to hear a business coach talk about that. If you've been involved with meditation or something, like I hear, like I'm in a marketing program, and the person says, well, when you think that thought, you just notice that's not a good thought, so replace it with a better thought. And I thought, that's too simple. And then on the other hand, it's like, well, but if you could do that, that's magical. That's an incredible skill. And it was actually really refreshing to hear it stripped of all the sort of I don't know, poetic or mystical or spiritual trappings that I might, like, okay, I'm gonna close my eyes for 45 minutes and my breath. It's like, no, just stop thinking that, think something else. But whichever way you do it, like that thought and my capacity to think what I want to think, and not think the other thing that takes me down, like that has everything to do with, am I going to be happy? Am I going to have a livelihood? Am I going to feel proud when I see my partner or my kids or my friends? Am I going to? So anyway, you can probably hear there's plenty of my own personal story in this, being that I never felt like a clear fit to like the jobs that were available out there. Of course, I spent plenty of time thinking that I'm no good, and all of that. Plenty of shame, that I've worked my way through. So I guess in a sense, it's just that classic kind of like, who am I here to help? Oh, people who, like who are kind of like me in some ways,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess that's kind of why I got into counseling, is to try and help people that are like me or have had experiences like me, and to help work through maybe some career stress, maybe some depression, maybe some anxiety, maybe some relationship difficulties, things that I've experienced that I feel like I might have some tools or some ways to help people with those things. And I think we're naturally attracted to help people that have had similar experiences to us. Yeah. And I did, when you were talking about entrepreneurs kind of, might have a problem that they want to solve in the world and haven't necessarily, found a job out there that is a 9 to 5 that they really, want to sink their teeth into. It just hasn't resonated for them. And I spent a little while, with an entrepreneur that I really was trying to help in his business. I wouldn't call myself an entrepreneurial creative type naturally, but I was very interested in the startup world and the technology world. So I volunteered to help this guy 1 day a week, and work in his business with him to try and get it off the ground. I think I learned a few things from that experience. One was that it's really, really difficult to take something from an idea to commercialize it and make it profitable. It's really, really tough. And the other is that it just can be super scary, because yeah, the failure can mean so much more than just the failure of a business or a marketing strategy. It can be very personal. And, you're talking about separating yourself from the success of the venture. Yeah, it sounds so simple, but it's so difficult to do when it has all these consequences for your financial situation, your family's financial situation, and everything else. So, yeah, I really admire entrepreneurs who have that grit and that tenacity to be able to push through the tough times and to get out the other side and to make it work.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And, on the other side, it's not that I exclusively think about working with entrepreneurs. I mean, also just overwhelmed professionals, right? But if we take your story again, like, or I don't know if this fits exactly because you didn't actually talk about your overall job satisfaction, but I think a lot of people have followed, a sort of prescribed path that they saw, and they found that they were competent at jumping through the right hoops. And then, they just discover that this doesn't feel meaningful at all. And
Yeah.
I can knock out, these tasks that I've been, rewarded with a certain kind of income for doing, but it just, what does it feel like to go through the motions, And
Yes.
so, kind of, even like going back to our discussion about, curiosity and boredom, like, do you want to be bored all the time? And, I've met plenty of people who would take that very pragmatic tone, and it's like, that's what you got to do. But it's just like, what I always heard was like, what you got to do is sacrifice your soul. And I was never quite willing to do that. But I even experienced shame on
Mm.
that level. Like, oh, maybe there's something wrong with me because I won't put on a suit.
Mm.
But partly I won't put on a suit because, like, I want to crawl out of my skin when I put it on. Like, I can't. Like, it just feels like such a, and I think I'm probably extreme in that sense. I can remember growing up, my parents made me put on formal clothes, and it was so uncomfortable. I probably have some whole wounding around that, But like honestly, there's a way that I think it's funny because I think on some level there's an aspect of maturity, which is just understanding that the world does work in a certain way, and we can't make the world conform to us. We have to conform to the world on some level. But then there's also a real question of like, where do I have to, and where is it choice?
Mm.
And kind of harking back to something else we said earlier, like, I think on some deep level, that's decided in the body. It's not decided up here, even though we rationalize it and explain our decisions later with words. It's like, how can I be comfortable in my own skin? I don't know if I can do it, if I have to wear this suit, or if I have to explain my ideas in these terms. Like, here's what feels like me. And
Yeah.
if I get too far away from, what feels like me, I can't do it. And of course, we can also get stuck by saying me is in this box and I can't move out. So I mean, I don't know. I guess part of what I'm just saying is like, I think the stuff is fascinating,
Yeah.
but but what's really, like, in my experience, everything that's really made a difference in my life, it's probably begun as like, oh, something just happened in my body,
Mm.
and
Mm.
then later I put it together, and then that's why I, made this decision, moved across the country, or whatever I did, but it's like those moments of insight are these powerful somatic flashes.
Yes. Yes.
You know?
Yes. 100%. Yeah, I agree with you. And I really liked what you're talking about being in tune with the body and knowing how to take care of what you're experiencing somatically. Because I feel like a lot of people shut down their somatic experience and just do what they're supposed to do because that's what they've been told they're supposed to do, and to earn a living and to have financial security and all of that is the utmost, and anything that you're experiencing that goes against that needs to be suppressed because that's a threat to how you should be in the world. And yeah, I think that was what I did as a young man for so many years, was to just shut down my somatic experience and ignore it, because in my childhood, it wasn't important. Emotions weren't really expressed very much in my house growing up, and they were kind of just ignored and set aside. And it's been a journey for me to get back in touch with my body, get back in touch with what I actually want from life, and to make space for that, and to make choices and decisions that serve that, so that I can be an integrated, holistic person, as opposed to a fragmented, segmented person that's just trying to make ends meet, but it isn't really content, or isn't really looking at the things that might make me discontent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you're saying there.
Mm. Well, and what's so interesting too is like, it sounds like when you describe growing up, and you know there was almost a kind of a pragmatic
Yeah,
thing where one thing that wasn't a problem was knowing what to do.
yeah,
And that can be a pathway to success to a certain degree. And so I think, you know, like if we zoom out again to like this moment that Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis, like I think we're kind of waking up to like there's been a lot of things we've been doing on autopilot that actually really worked to a certain extent. And now the real difficulty is confronting the discomfort of, what's needed. And this is another place where I feel like whether it's in counseling or meditation or Feldenkrais, one of the other things that I find so fascinating is that a lot of transformative change happens just because we develop the capacity to look for a longer duration of time than we normally would at the thing that we generally don't want to look at.
yeah,
And I mean, you can talk about, I just looked at this situation and then suddenly I saw a thing and then I knew what I had to do. And the thing that I had to do afterwards might be difficult. There might be all kind of resistance. But when you see something clearly enough, we don't like lying to ourselves. Like it's one thing to be ignorant and to do it, but then when I see that my ignorance has this particular, like it's like a particular recipe that I've been, cooking myself and serving myself for dinner over and over. As soon as like I know that, I don't know, this food is gonna kill me, I could keep eating it. It still tastes, but it's like now I know what I'm doing to myself. And so I think, this is the tricky thing about this path is like there's an early stage where you can kind of pick up on the discomfort and not see what's on the other side. And you just see why would I want this? Like, back to the thing I wrote, it's like Netflix is so much better than this. Why would I want that? But, I mean, it maybe sounds like I'm saying eat your vegetables, but there is an aspect to practicing for something that it is eating your vegetables. But you can also at a certain point go like, wow, these vegetables, like they taste so much better on some level than all of that chocolate cake I've been stuffing. I feel like there's a way that like I don't know, funny metaphors, but
yeah.
yeah,
100%. Like there's a way that there can be nourishment in the practices, and sometimes I'll find myself practicing and I'll be resistant to the practices because it might not necessarily be the most fun or interesting thing that I could be doing in that moment, but I know that if I keep investing in these practices, that it will enrich my life in so many ways that Netflix isn't going to do. And so I keep investing in them. Yeah, absolutely.
right.
Yeah. I mean, I was interested when you spoke about Vervaeke and the meaning crisis and the things that we've done to get us to this point aren't necessarily the things that are going to get us beyond this point. And some of us are waking up to that fact now. I started thinking about Ken Wilber and his model. Are you familiar with Ken Wilber at all?
I've read a book, struggled through one of his books, but yeah, I think some of the concepts make sense to me.
Yeah, so the particular concept that I was thinking of that came to mind was this idea of cultures having levels of consciousness that they go through. And the culture, I think Australia and the US are very similar in that we are both cultures of highly rational, highly driven for success, highly scientific, highly economic growth oriented. And Ken Wilber would call that the orange level or the modern level. And then there's a postmodern level or a green level that I would say is typified by Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden and Finland and those countries where they still have science and rationalism, and they still have economic growth as something that is important to those societies, but they also have a sense of egalitarianism, a sense of looking after the environment, a sense of everyone in its society is important, has intrinsic value, and is worth taking care of. And there seems to me to be distinctions that you can make on the level of culture. Not that a culture is better than or more advanced than, but you could say is more integrated than, and that there are levels of cultural development that are beyond that, even beyond that bounds. And these changes might take many decades, sometimes even centuries to happen, but the fact that there is a there is somewhat gives me hope, let's say, that as an individual I can make the changes I can make to me and my system and my sphere around me, but also as a culture we can move towards positive change as well over time and make changes on a cultural societal level too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I was listening to you, what occurred to me is I think this situation that we're in now, and again, what I got from John Vervaeke and the framing that is like, I think in my own lifetime, all those things that have happened on the planet that we call history, like the class that I was falling asleep in college that was called history, like I just don't think history was alive for me in the way it has become in the last few years. And now I have a sense of I'm not living in a static thing called, the 1980s, which is how that felt when I was a kid, or the 1990s. Those were just things. Now I feel like I'm living in this moment that could shift in a whole number of different directions. And, given that, existential risk is like a thing that actually people talk about. I mean, I don't know how many talk about Netflix. I don't know how many like end of the world movies I've consumed. And I don't think they used to make that many end of the world movies, in previous generations. Like, this is the dialogue now. But what I think is on some level really exciting about it is like what we were just talking about. Like, what does it take for a person to sort of drop all their assumptions and say, let me try something completely different? I actually think that, whatever does happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're in a moment where transformation as an idea, I think, is maybe more at the forefront. I mean, I don't know. I didn't live through the 60s. That was probably maybe there was a feeling like that back then. Like you mentioned Esalen, what would have been like to be in that place. But I can go back and forth between being pessimistic and optimistic about, humanity and whatnot. But one thing that seems really clear is like, wow, there's a lot of stuff that's up in the air right now. And, to propose to people that they try something they've never tried before, maybe is easier to do,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
than at other moments. And that's always been what's, sort of driven me, just partly because like I often found that what was being presented to me, I couldn't figure it out. And, we do it this other way. And I mean,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah, totally. There's a quality of openness to trying something different. That's nice at the moment. Yeah. So yeah, we've been talking for over an hour now. I think I was gonna start moving towards wrapping it up. But before I do that, is there anything that feels unfinished for you, or that you wanted to say in particular?
Yeah, well, I was just kind of feeling into that myself, just making your acquaintance, as we said, shake your hand. It's just, there is something even fascinating to me about the fact that we're having this conversation. I wouldn't be the first person to wax poetic about Zoom or something. That's not what I mean. But it is really, um, I don't know, the possibility of just sort of putting yourself out there, like the internet connected us somehow, but there is something that's resonant, like of all the billions of people like you and I are talking right now. And there's something about just putting out ideas, that can resonate. And then, yeah, that could be another whole conversation for another time. But like I mentioned my musical background, and part of how I sort of put things together. Um, there's a phrase that came from a conversation actually between John and Guy, where they talked about the musicality of being.
Yeah, I remember that. Yes.
Yeah. So I teach a monthly workshop now called the musicality of being.
Yes.
And one of the ways that it makes sense for me is just like when I try to understand what we would call wholeness or us all being one or something. Well, there's all kinds of complexity and there's all kinds of different things happening, but how do they fit? And, you could look around you and you could see all of the phenomena and just it's random and it's like noise. And that would be a way of looking, right? That would be a way of, you know, or you could say there's some order here and you could actually be listening for the order. And that would be like the world as music. And so that's one of the things that I orient to. And there were some, like, I don't know if you'd be familiar with, there's an experimental musician composer, John Cage. Actually, okay, he was very interested in Zen Buddhism and Tao Te Ching and all those kinds of things as well. But his most famous composition is called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And it was performed by this pianist, David Tudor, who's like world-renowned virtuoso pianist. And they did the concert, I forget where, but it was in some church. And, David Tudor comes out and it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds and it's in 3 movements. And I think the piano lid is open. And he walks up to the piano and he sits down and he closes the lid of the piano. And then he sits there for like a minute or something. And then he opens the piano lid. And that's the second movement. And then he sits there for another couple minutes and then he closes it. And then at a certain point he stands up and it's like he's incredible virtuoso pianist who never plays a single note. And then he walks off the stage. And it's also called silent piece or silence. But the thing is, of course, there was all kinds of sound going on the whole time. People are sitting in these uncomfortable church pews and so I remember learning about this, when I was thinking I was going to be a musician, but that's actually for me a kind of a touchstone of how I understand, awareness practice. And
Mm.
like he was sort of saying, look, music is already happening here,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, and and a lot of people didn't agree and they hated it and it was controversial, but it's like I think that's kind of our opportunity is to listen to the music of the world in that way. And then if this is music, how would I be in harmony with it?
mm. Yeah. Wow, beautiful, beautiful. I really like that. Yeah, very
Yeah.
good. It's been,
Yeah, so, I mean,
sorry, go
it's
ahead.
just gonna say pleasure,
Yeah,
to connect with
absolutely.
you and to have this conversation. Love
Yeah,
to continue it and see where
definitely.
it goes. Yeah,
Yeah, there is some resonance there. Yeah, this whole world, this little corner of the internet, as it's being coined, there is some resonance there, and there's something in common, and it's nice just to connect and just share experience, and yeah,
right,
yeah, it's
right.
beautiful.
Well, and I can feel that there's this little, almost like this shyness, because I'm just getting to know you, or this shyness of like, oh, will this be on YouTube, and how did this sound? And yet, one of the things that really drew me to all these dialogues that I saw was the sense that at a certain point people forget about the fact that it's
Yeah,
being filmed, and that
yeah,
you're just seeing people really wrestle with ideas. And I thought, God, I want to be part of that.
yeah,
So being invited, because I have a podcast and I invite people, but being the invitee, it's an honor in that sense too, because it feels like, oh, I'm being invited to be part of this conversation, and I hope I have something to contribute. But I mean, this is one of the most exciting things to me, is just to be a participant,
yeah.
in this.
Yeah,
So
100%. And that was part of the motivation for me starting this little YouTube channel. Like I just wanted to contribute to the conversation or be part of the conversation that I was listening to and that I was getting so much out of. Um,
right,
and so this was my little way of just dipping my toe in the water and being like, well, let's just talk to some people and see what
yeah,
happens.
yeah, totally,
Yeah,
totally,
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, cool.
Very nice to meet you, Seth, and yeah, very lovely being with you. Yeah.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much.
Cool, man. All right, take it easy. And I hope to see you again. Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay.
Thanks,
Take
Seth.
care.
Bye.